All right, let's get started. Hello and welcome. My name is Becca Schmiel, and I'm an Associate Program Director within the NSF Directorate for Technology, Innovation, and Partnerships, or the TIP Directorate. We'll be specifically discussing the quantum systems, interconnects, and integrated photonics X-Labs topic that was announced as part of the first batch of NSF X-Labs. And we're available today to answer any questions you have on the X-Labs initiative. You can also find a recording of our previous webinars where we presented an introduction to the X-Labs and slides associated with that webinar on the X-Labs initiative webpage on nsf.gov. Just scroll down to I think it's the events and resources section, and it should be present there. You can also find a recording of our previous Q&A for the other X-Labs topic, which is the sensing and imaging topic. So very briefly, to participate in the Q&A and submit your questions, just click on the Q&A button. Your question has the best chance of being answered if you begin the question with a number of the category it would belong to. So this is going to help us organize the questions coming in. We're going to go to some other announcements first, but please keep this in mind that we are looking for that number of the category ahead of your question in order to answer it effectively. So before we proceed, I want to highlight the documents available on sam.gov for your reference. We're going to be reviewing information from these documents throughout the webinar. The first document is the Other Transaction Agreement Solutions Offering, or the OTASO, which essentially serves as the overall master solicitation for X-Labs. The second is the topic announcement specifically for quantum systems, interconnects, and integrated photonics. The OTASO is going to contain details about the overall NSF X-Labs opportunity, while the topic announcement is going to provide information about the timeline and specific scope of the quantum systems topic. Both of the documents are hosted on sam.gov, where NSF is going to post contract solicitations. They are not available on research.gov, which is where NSF posts standard financial award instruments. I will just mention there is an amendment available to the OTASO, and it is present on both of these links. So on both the quantum systems link and the OTASO link, there is an amendment. If you're using an older link, you may have to go up to the top right corner of the sam.gov webpage where it says version, and you're going to have to click the most recent version. So that's the version that's dated late June. And that's going to take you to the amendment. Unfortunately, it doesn't update automatically with the amendment document from the previous links. So please watch out for that. We're going to go to Joda next to tell us about a little bit more about this amendment.
Yes, thank you. So we really intended for this update to the OTASU, particularly section 6.1.1, to really reflect a couple of major clarifications that we wanted to make to really underscore that this is a holistic factor assessment and not a set of rigid rules. We set out a list of objectives that teams ought to meet in order to demonstrate fidelity to the program model. And these are really reflected in a set of standards that we'll be comparing your proposals to. Not every single one of these needs to be sort of a black and white checkbox, but rather it's going to be almost a rubric that we step through and sort of assess every proposal to determine whether or not there's sufficient fidelity to the program. Some teams are going to do a better job on meeting some of these objectives than others, and so they'll be stronger on some and then weaker on others. And because their mission and team composition are really particularly strong, that might be satisfactory, whereas others might be similarly weak in other areas, but the mission may be not as compelling, and so those weaknesses will count a little bit more heavily. Taking a step back, the way teams should be thinking about these changes is that they are really designed to ensure that the teams have the necessary independence and autonomy they need to execute on their mission without substantial delays or sort of bureaucratic, unnecessary bureaucratic rules that would sort of delay their ability to hire the people they need, to attract the talent they need to be able to set the research direction. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we are discouraging or prohibiting teams from needing to comply with common sense best practices, HR policies, or laws that are designed to prevent or eliminate fraud, waste, and abuse. So each of these autonomy factors are really designed to hit at a key point that we think is really important for an X-Lab team to be successful. They're not collectively exhaustive, so it's possible that a team could have addressed each of these, but there might be some specific edge case or particular quality a team has that makes us very concerned about their autonomy levels that we didn't encompass here. We hope that these are exhaustive of the realm of possibility, the range of possibilities, but it's not 100% guarantee that every single concern that we might have is captured here, but they should capture most. So as you all are thinking about how your team fits these independence and autonomy factors, just know that we are assessing these holistically, that we expect that many teams, given the timeframes, are going to need to negotiate or develop or further evolve some of the factors that or models or approaches that they put in place to accomplish these standards and objectives over the phase 0 period. So for example, in the intellectual property framework, there's actually not a tremendous amount required at the phase 0 application period that requires a bunch of detailed finalized plans, but rather we acknowledge that teams are most likely going to be resolving some of these things as they move forward. But we do want to see that as a broad framework, as a broad approach, that there is the fidelity to the program model and that you have the capacity to meet the sort of programmatic intent. I'm sure we'll get into more specifics, but across each of these pieces in the questions you all might have, but really know that this is intended to sort of codify and clarify our programmatic intent from the very beginning, that a broad range of organizational types are eligible, but independence and autonomy are important. And if there's factors that are going to be important for a host institution, particularly if you're an X-Lab team hosted inside a parent institution, that need to be resolved over a longer runway, that might be practicable over the next couple of weeks. Just know that you're going to have the bulk of the phase 0 planning period, as well as even the period between submitting a phase 0 initial proposal and then for the down select that invites a subset of those applications for oral presentations, there will be an additional set of information provided. So this is just the first sort of checkpoint, and the first thing that folks should be really thinking about are, do we have a clear, compelling mission that fits the program model? Do we have a broad framework? And are we demonstrating the capacity to be in compliance or have fidelity to the broader program? So with that, I'll stop and turn it back over to you, Becca.
Okay, thank you, Joda. So here is a timeline for the quantum systems topic. Written proposals are going to be due by July 24th. Oral presentations are going to take place sometime the week of August 31st. And we do anticipate that teams are going to finish negotiations with NSF around November and begin the phase 0 by December. After a 9-month phase 0, the phase 1 is going to start around September 2027. The go-no-go selection process will begin around 2 months prior, when NSF will begin to evaluate the phase 0 progress and determine which of the teams are going to transition to phase 1. And with that, I would like to invite everyone to join our Q&A session. So please welcome our moderator, Bridget Taraga, and our Q&A panelists, Joda back, as well as Paul Ampadu, Adam Russell, and Patrick Breen. They're going to help me answer your questions during this Q&A webinar. And to participate, please do click that Q&A button and submit your questions. Again, your questions are going to have the best chance of being answered if you begin the question with the number of the category it would belong to. And this is going to help us organize the questions coming in. We are not going to be able to answer all of the questions. We'll do our best to focus on the questions that are not clearly answered in the OTASO or the FAQ document. There is, by the way, an FAQ document that might be published down the line.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Becca. Thanks for the background, and thanks all for the questions that have come in through our inbox as well as that are coming in today. We're going to start with a few questions from the inbox, and then we'll move to those that are coming in the Q&A. Adam, I'd like to direct the first question to you. Should the entire team be confirmed starting from phase 0 or phase 1? Are the teams expected to be the same throughout all phases, or is there any area for change during phases?
Thanks, Bridget. Thanks. Can you hear me? Sound check, sound check. Good. Okay. Thanks. Thank you for everybody attending this. The answer that I would offer to that question is yes and no. And here's what I mean by that. So remember the goal, what I'm most excited about with X-Labs is the goal to find new mechanisms to move from research insight to like real world impact. And as part of that, phase 0 is this pretty innovative initiative is meant to give people the sort of runway that's necessary to make that transition from insight to impact, which means that that there's time in phase 0 to sort of come up with the right team, as it were, right? Your teaming schedule. That said, we expect a lot of the team will initially be in place, or at least have a good structure to it in phase 0. So with the goal of getting to phase 1 milestone, and then ultimately potentially phase 2, we want teams that really do reflect the demands that are going to be required for this sort of topic. So we expect there'll be a range of personnel and experience, but for the same reasons that the teams will probably change, and that's why it's been built in as a mechanism for the NSF X-Labs initiative. The way I think about this is, if you're going to do something, as I think as powerful as it is, you're going to need degrees of freedom. So for phase 0, that is the degrees of freedom that are being baked in for the teams to take advantage of. And I would actually encourage people to think about this as an opportunity now to build kind of a dream team, right? You are in some sense starting from scratch and being given the resources and the license to do that. So think big about like, what would that dream team look like, but also know, again, as I started out with, there is room for maneuver, and as the needs and the experiences evolve in these teams, we expect the teams also will do the same, which is why it's being built in the way it is. Over.
Joda, I'm going to propose this next question to you, please. What IP framework is required to satisfy the NSF X-Labs autonomy factor assessment?
Yeah, so the both tough and hopefully reassuring component of this is that there's not, a prescribed one-size-fits-all answer. NSF expects that there are going to be a number of different pathways or approaches that teams can use to meet the autonomy factor assessment's IP standard. And a couple of things that I want to note. Teams are expected to develop an IP management plan during phase 0. So they do not need to have this done ahead of time. Teams are really supposed to develop an IP management plan that is specifically designed to facilitate and enable broad technology dissemination that's unencumbered by burdensome institutional restrictions that might severely limit the capacity of an X-Labs team to broadly out-license technologies developed during the performance period. And that might result in a negotiation between NSF and the parent institution or the X-Labs team to ensure that that is correctly tuned, recognizing there are trade-offs and there's not, again, a single set of answers. But the basic bottom line is that NSF expects the X-Labs team to have substantial input and control over the IP it produces during the period of performance. Now, that comes with a whole bunch of asterisks that I'm sure you're all thinking about, and your attorneys are going to think about, and your VPRs are going to think about how do you deal with background IP, and how do you make sure that it complies with state law and all the obligations necessary that come with maybe the Bayh-Dole Amendment for your universities. We recognize that there are going to be questions and challenges in maybe figuring out what the right solution is. We're committed to, for the right team that has a great idea, working through that solution with you, assuming that we have willing negotiating partners on the other side. I think at the same time, we want to make sure that teams are able to articulate during the phase 0 application period that they're committed to negotiating and have a broad framework in mind on how they would plan to do that. And I've thought creatively about how they're going to ensure that the IP is something that can benefit a broad range of users, and not just one specific set of institutions, or that institution might have a chokehold on the IP such that it doesn't effectively translate out. So those are the things that we are thinking about. Again, we don't necessarily have a one-size-fits-all answer, but we hope that gets you started.
Thanks, Joda. Becca, we're getting a lot of questions on eligibility. Can you tell us, are university faculty eligible to apply for the X-Labs program based on the IP, the full-time and independent organization requirements?
Yes, of course. The university faculty are absolutely eligible to apply. It's just important to note that by phase 1, all senior key personnel are expected to be dedicated full-time to the team. So there's not going to be one model for an NSF X-Labs team, and university faculty members are going to probably be arranging leaves of absences or other arrangements that they have with the university in order to maintain their appointment during phase 1. And teams can also be established within the university, if the university is appropriately structured to meet the autonomy factor assessment. But NSF does not dictate specifically how the faculty will be involved with the X-Labs program. And the senior key personnel are not going to be expected to be full-time on the X-Labs team until they are informed of their team selection for the phase 1 award. So they have that phase 0 period to really figure out what needs to be done, and also if they're going to be selected for the phase 1. Also, I should note that university faculty members can participate in other roles outside of senior key personnel. They could be subcontractors partnering with a team. They might be advisors for the team, and they might be other types of kind of part-time employees. That's not a problem at all.
Adam, we have another question on who can serve as senior key personnel. Can FFRDCs or staff scientists at national laboratories serve as senior key personnel with institutional approval?
Yes, to our knowledge, they can. It'll depend upon their actual agreements and their contracts that they have with whatever institution is backing them. So they'll have to figure out kind of how they can apply. But to our knowledge and to our kind of stance, they are eligible to serve as senior key personnel and to partner with X-Labs teams.
Becca, let me just quickly add. So see the earlier comment about dream team, right? The notion of a dream team is who are the people, what are the facilities, what are the capabilities that you need to bring to bear to tackle this I think really unique opportunity and challenge. So if they happen to be in those places, we encourage you to look at them accordingly. The other thing I would just quickly emphasize is the term full-time. I know there's been some discussion around what does that actually mean. I think it's an appropriate approach to say what would a reasonable person consider to be full-time. I think if someone were on the project notionally as a senior key personnel and it's 50% time, I don't think anybody would say that's full-time. But does it have to be a specific percentage? That's not entirely clear. So I think the degrees of freedom are involved here, and what would be reasonable for someone to be considered full-time, where the goal really is here to put your head down and work with urgency and focus. Again, with this opportunity that I'm excited about, and hopefully y'all are as well. Over.
I'll just also add for FFRDC, sorry, Bridget. If you do have partners, or if you are an FFRDC or another kind of national lab style, just submit the proposal, and we'll figure out the teaming and the agreements and partnerships from there.
Okay, Joda, here's a question for you. Is an application more competitive if it comes with matching funds or cost share?
Not necessarily, no. So cost sharing is not a requirement for applicants, nor is it a prerequisite for advancing beyond phase 0. In fact, the structure of the program is really designed to provide the necessary support, financial support, for the teams through the period of performance for achieving key milestones. Now, if you have matching funding, I think that there could be a role for that and playing a key part of your model. And I think that will be sort of on a case-by-case basis. But there's not necessarily a penalty or for a team that's not submitting with matching funding, or a specific advantage or bonus for teams that are bringing funding alongside them. Now, I think that there's always edge cases and exceptions here, but I think that broadly speaking, this call was not designed necessarily to start with a specific explicit cost share.
Ashok, I'd like to bring you on to answer an OT contract question. What can we expect from the negotiation period for the OT contract?
Right. So unlike your traditional grant or contract that folks may be used to, other transactions agreements allow for a lot more flexibility in establishing that final agreement between the awardee and the government. And they're different and more efficient in a number of ways. Really what the process requires for negotiations is active engagement from all parties involved. So the government, the awardee, and any of the awardee partner organizations that they're bringing along with them, right? We need to sit down between the NSF staff, NSF program staff, NSF acquisition staff, and the awardee to negotiate on the specific terms in the specific terms that will be finalized in the award document in and of itself. So that would be everything from finalizing milestones, finalizing payment terms, negotiating if we need to some of the specific or general terms and conditions we typically apply to other transactions. And once we resolve all of those issues, we go ahead and make the final award document. So that process can be as expeditious as we'd like it to be, as long as everyone is there actively involved and engaged in moving that forward. If there's substantial disagreement, we can work through those too, but it generally is a fairly easy process. Most of what will end up in that final OT document, most of what we'll be working on during the course of negotiations, is either out there right now in sort of the standard terms and conditions that you see in the OTASO itself, or you can read the NSF Other Arrangements and Other Transactions Guide. That document also has a lot of our standard terms and conditions, so you can be aware of those things we'll be talking about as we move towards award in advance of having to have those discussions.
Thanks, Patrick. And Paul, this next question is for you. We've seen a lot of teams ask some version of, is our quantum system idea in scope for the X-Labs program? What is the best way to help teams figure out whether their idea is in scope for quantum systems? And Paul, you'll have to come off mute and start again for us, please.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so I was saying that for this particular X-Labs quantum systems topic, we're looking for quantum integrated quantum photonics and quantum interconnect and related technologies. So this is particularly what we're looking for. I would ask myself 3 questions to ensure that what I'm proposing is indeed in scope, right? One is am I developing a platform technology, not just some incremental upgrade of existing technologies, right? Is this the kind of high risk, high reward acceleration that X-Labs has been designed for? And the third one is, does the quantum technology I'm proposing go beyond today's limits in a way that could open new frontiers in quantum computing, quantum information processing? So I would base my answers on these three main questions. And if the answer to the questions is yes, then it's quite possibly in scope. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Adam, a question for you. What is the exit strategy for the X-Labs teams? What happens after phase 2?
Yeah, thanks, Bridget. I part of the reason I also love NSF X-Labs is because of all the excellent X puns. So what is the exit strategy? Sorry, you can all hang up now if you want. I apologize. What are the exit strategies? Well, so that's what's really, I think, interesting about this program is we don't have a prescribed exit strategy for teams. In fact, this is an opportunity for the teams themselves to come in with and begin to craft those exit strategies. I think, I mean, again, given the larger mission that we're here to move insight to impact, it is clear that, like, you know, the exit strategy needs to be thought of early, and is something that's going to, you know, help really kind of make that impact that we're looking for. We can imagine, and I'm always sort of loath to over imagine in public because I don't want to anchor people on, like, oh, they said this, therefore it must be that they're looking for. On the contrary, but we can imagine things where, you know, an X-Lab in particular makes a breakthrough that then gets turned into, you know, a startup or a small business. The goal being, of course, that would then allow for the commercialization of their technology that is meant to seed an entire field of science or technology. In some cases, you know, an X-Labs, I think, could well be positioned to move into like the NSF's Tech Accelerator program and get, you know, keep that inertia up to make, again, that impact. In some cases, X-Labs, you know, having accomplished their goal in phase 2, just may no longer need to benefit from the X-Labs funding, and will have found additional exit strategies in those spaces. In some cases, perhaps, especially once X-Labs may be moving into a higher TRL, there might be situations where it's like phase 3 funding makes a lot more sense to buy, again, additional time to both manifest that exit strategy and then bake that impact. If what you're hearing here is degrees of freedom equals case by case basis, that's probably the right interpretation. There is no template, there is no archetype in this space, which is why I think it's really exciting. But it also means that we can't do the thinking for you. We can do the thinking with you, but not for you. So all of these things should not be considered as like the only path to graduating X-Labs. We expect the paths will vary from team to team. We don't expect everyone to know exactly what that looks like during phase 0, but it will be a topic of conversation and should be a topic of thought for those teams who are applying. Over.
Thank you. Paul, we have another question related to the technology and the scope for you. Paul, how does the X-Lab topic define the term second generation quantum systems?
Yeah, so you know, second generation quantum systems are, you know, the we can think of things like the semiconductor revolution as first generation quantum technologies, right? Second generation quantum technologies focus on things like superposition, really exploit the properties of quantum directly, right? To create systems that, you know, really embrace things like entanglement and others to build really specific quantum systems.
Another question related to technology. Can a mission whose core platform is a methodology and acceptance standard for certifying entanglement preservation across a heterogeneous network qualify on its own, or must the platform be a hardware transduction device? with certification as supporting work?
I can help take this one, but Paul, please feel
Sure,
free to jump in.
go ahead, Becca. Yeah.
I think the answer that Paul initially gave with those questions of, is this going to be ambitious enough? Is this something that is really going to change the scope of what is possible in quantum technologies and in second generation quantum hardware, is a really important one here. So we don't clearly define that you explicitly need to develop like specific types of hardware, or that you explicitly need to approach this in one particular way. We are looking for a variety of approaches. If it is too narrow in its scope, or if it's not a platform technology that can lift up many other types of technologies in this field, or future discoveries and innovations, then it's probably not ambitious enough, and it probably does not have it may not be within scope of X-Labs. But we don't like put hard lines on what exactly that mission might be. We are not looking for test beds, I should say. Nor are we looking for kind of repositories of data.
Yeah, Becca, I think you captured it pretty well, right? Yeah.
I'm saying it may be in scope.
Related to scope, are encryption technologies in scope?
If they are not quantum interconnects, integrated quantum photonics, or their supporting technologies, they would not be in scope.
Does this topic include sensing or imaging platforms whose innovation is in physics-faithful reconstruction from captured data, or only novel measurement hardware itself?
It sounds like this is referring to the other topic, which is scientific instrumentation for sensing and imaging, which does include, I believe we did call out in the topic description quantum sensors in that. So my answer is very similar. It should be ambitious in scope. It should be able to change the way we do sensing and imaging for that particular call. And if it's those two things, it may be in scope. I'm not going to get into the details of exactly like this technique or another. If it's a bold, ambitious, impactful idea, you should consider applying. But to the other topic, please, that the deadline for that is July 13th.
Now let's move on to proposal submission. Do citations count towards the 8-page proposal limit?
Yes, you will not be able to upload a document that is over 8 pages. So please make sure that when you are preparing that, there should be no cover letter. You'll submit the cover letter on the application. It'll turn into a cover letter for us. And keep it within an 8-page proposal.
And just note that I'm sure you were all thinking, like, how in the world am I supposed to, describe this ambitious plan and all the research and then cite the science? Think of this as a broad concept note that gives us enough information to understand your credibility, that the broad approach you're going to take, the mission, really hammer home on the mission's alignment with the call and why this is going to have sort of platform technology significance that we're looking for, and then your ability as a team to deliver that based on your prior track record and experience and approach. But recognize that we know that we're going to have more questions than answers at the end of this process, and that's by design.
Also related to the proposal, are letters of support required? Is there an expected template for the letter of collaboration or criteria that NSF expects to be met as an artifact of a partner's willingness to collaborate on a funded X-Lab?
So it states in the OTASO document that letters of collaboration are optional, and they would be submitted at the full proposal stage, at the oral proposal package stage. And so you don't have to worry about those yet. Just simply describe your team and your team capabilities section for the written proposal. They are not required. If you have identified like specific collaborators, or people you want to subcontract with, let us know. If you don't, they're not required. And in fact, we do appreciate teams that are really focused and dedicated at this time. And there's always room to grow, right? Like there's phase zeros, phase ones, collaborations can come later.
Can we upload our Science CV biosketches and supporting documents early in case we are unavailable at the time we are notified of progress to the oral proposal stage?
There's not going to be an opportunity for you to upload those early. But if you know that during that time period and the turnaround between the written proposals and the oral proposals that you will be gone, I would prepare them early. There is documentation for how to prepare them in the OTASO, and you could prepare them early and have them available for someone else to submit on your behalf. Do not submit them to us early, please.
On the topic of review, does having a history of applying for NSF proposals, or for example, having been a recipient of the NSF GRFP, benefit the team's application package in any way?
We are looking for expertise in the field. That being said, we're not looking deeply for hitting a specific check mark of different qualifications or different specific types of expertise. If your team has already been funded quite a bit of money by VC, then it may be reaching the point where it's a little bit out of scope. If it's already gained a lot of, your idea has already gained a lot of financial traction with industry and VCs. However, if you have been awarded an SBIR or a GRFP, I don't think that is the same as significant industry investment.
And it teams like individual, like the individual people within a team, your research experience, your
Entrepreneurship.
Yeah, all of that is sort of holistically assessed in your providing us the texture and information we need to know that you can execute on a really ambitious mission. So, if you propose a very ambitious mission that looks amazing, but then we can't see that your team has the track record of being able to do those kinds of things, or that your research experience doesn't lend to you being able to deliver on that, I think there's going to raise a lot of skepticism on our end, even though the ambition might be there, that you may not have the right team and necessary to accomplish it. So I said in the context that your experience might help you tell that story, I think that's really important.
Please do show us that you're technically qualified and that from a leadership perspective, your team is qualified to be able to execute upon this kind of mission.
Where can I find the scoring criteria for the proposals? And will the reviewers be government, academic, or industry?
You can find the criteria in the OTASO. I believe it is section 11 and section 13, if I remember that off the top of my head, for both the written proposal and the oral proposal. For the written proposal, we will be using federal reviewers. For the oral proposal, we are anticipating using a mixture of federal reviewers and non-federal reviewers. For all of those non-federal external reviewers, they will all be signing NDAs, so they will not be able to kind of speak about the proposal, but we will be using that kind of peer review proposal for the oral proposal decisions. And remember, this is a contract, and contracting, it goes through different procedures than a typical grant or financial assistance award system.
And just one other thing on the reviewers, I've seen a couple versions of this question, which is like, what's the audience of the reviewers? I would expect that across the board, you're going to have a mix of technical subject matter experts who are leaders in their field, that are extraordinarily relevant to the proposals that you all are submitting, and then also industry leaders and experts from different sectors that might have an adjacency to the work that you're doing. So know that you're going to be speaking to maybe a couple of different layers of technical expertise. So I think your proposal should be written, specific enough to provide a sense of credibility for subject matter experts, but also to demonstrate the impact and significance of your proposal to folks who might be coming from a technically adjacent field or in a space that has industry relevance to the work that you're proposing.
How many awards are expected for phase 0 for the quantum systems topic?
I understand that this is a really interesting question. We are not specifying exactly how many awards we want to award at the end of the day, because we are looking for those really big ideas, and we want to be able to fund the teams that we really believe in. So we are not kind of honing in on a specific number of teams that will support.
Is technology that is currently ITAR restricted or classified within scope?
This might be a question for you, Bridget.
NSF does not fund classified research, and so we will be focusing on unclassified research here. Okay, and now we have a number of questions related to team eligibility and setup. Can you explain how an X-Lab differs from a startup company with a particularly revolutionary idea?
I think to start with, a startup company that might have a really big idea is going to still have, I think, a pretty significant emphasis on commercialization, quite early. And it's tough because, like, I think there are certainly exceptions to the rule where you might have a company that has extraordinarily patient investors, a significant amount of capital, and the freedom to go do a lot of R&D for many years. I think many investors in many companies would say that was very rare. And so I think that would be the distinguishing factor. It's not that it's impossible, but I do think that an X-Lab is really designed to produce the technology acceleration and advancement rather than necessarily to commercialize as an entity. Now, that doesn't preclude that commercialization could be an outcome one day, but the sort of primary metrics of success are going to be the technical milestones that the X-Labs team is expected to execute on in delivering on that technical mission, rather than sort of looking to sort of get to a commercial success point overall. I think that it's really a matter of emphasis. I invite my colleagues to sort of jump in or clarify if they.
No, I fully agree with that. Last week I was at a quarterly meeting for another NSF program that really focused on startup incubation. We were asking pretty high risk technical startups to present on their progress. And a lot of their mentorship that I heard was a lot of advice for how can these teams make a minimum viable product? How can these teams commercialize quickly, get to profitability quickly, or they're going to not survive well? And I think what we're doing here in X-Labs is in some ways trying to free a lot of academic teams or a lot of teams with a really big risky idea from that sort of structure before the technology is ready, and to really incubate high risk ideas that we don't necessarily want to immediately spin out to the first stage of minimum viable product profitability. We want to give you and your team the ability and the structure to be able to explore really big ideas that just are not supported by our current startup structure. And that's the kind of non-traditional teams that we're aiming to attract to this program.
Yeah, Becca, can I offer, with my own background, of course, in the ARPAs, I think to me the single largest differentiator is that risk tolerance. We're willing to buy risk where it may not actually work. It technically may not turn out to be feasible, but we're willing to take that bet because we think, first of all, it's possible, but secondly, given the runway, given the time, given the degrees of freedom that are being offered, outside of the immediate, commercial incentives that are frequently found in areas like VC. We're willing to bet that like there are breakthroughs to be had if people are willing to buy on that risk. I would also like to emphasize there are some things they do have in common, and I think one of them will be, as you and Judd have already pointed out, Becca, is this entrepreneurial nature of the whole thing, right? That this does will require, I think, people who are willing to think along these lines, both in terms of the technological innovation that can be done, but also, the design innovation of putting these new labs together. That's going to require us kind of that entrepreneurial spirit and gusto, which I know is out there. Over.
It'd be great to have one of our panelists address how different folks in academia can participate, as we're getting a number of questions here. So how can faculty, grad students, and separately postdocs participate? For faculty, for example, does academic faculty leaves of absence need to be able to cover the whole phase 1 and phase 2 timeline, or is a smaller portion acceptable? And for graduate students and postdocs, should they primarily remain affiliated with the universities, or do they leave the universities?
I'm going to tackle the second question first. We are not specifying at all how the affiliations should be structured, or how the actual arrangements of the different employees should be structured. And that's because we see a wide range of different possibilities for this, right? Like if you're going to have a team hosted within a university, of course, they're going to be affiliated with the university. If you're going to have a team, I mean, we're not dictating that, we're imagining that it's going to be affiliated with the university. If you're going to have a team that is bringing together a lot of different expertise, and maybe they're on special arrangements with their universities, we're not saying that they can't, those faculty couldn't still have, affiliations, or say that they are affiliated with the university, or even that they, there's a kind of a indirect cost structure that is possible there as well. There's a lot of different options for what this could be, and for how to structure faculty being kind of senior key personnel that are full-time on the program. If a faculty member does not want to stay, the full phase 1 into phase 2, we are expecting that a lot of these teams are going to grow and evolve over time. It may make sense for a faculty member to no longer be senior key personnel, right? To go to part-time, or to go to an advisor role. Just to note, between each of these phase changes and during the program, we are expecting the senior key personnel qualifications to be quite high, right? In order to qualify for the next phase, you need to have a really stellar top-tier team. But otherwise, I mean, there are a lot of options for how a team will evolve and how a team can structure themselves. We just expect those faculty members or those senior key personnel to be full-time. Talking about postdocs and graduate students, I see postdocs as really ideal for this type of program, right? They are typically people who go out and start startups, or who might go off and go into industry. This is another option, right, for a postdoc, or someone who recently did a postdoc, or someone who just graduated with their PhD, to have a really impactful career in the sciences, in my eyes. Graduate students, this is more to do with the arrangements for how one could fund labs. So that might be, there's different ways to do it. There's no reason why they can't be affiliated with the X-Lab, and it may be also the case that they and the postdocs are subcontracted by the X-Lab team as well.
Becca, you mentioned subcontracting. How does the X-Labs program distinguish collaborators from subcontractors? What definitions for these terms should the teams be using?
I believe this has to do mostly with money, right? Like if the teams are funding another, if they're making if they are sending money to the other, to their collaborators, at that point they'll be subcontracting out. And then if they are just collaborating with different teams, they might be sending money, they might not, right? The collaborators could be subcontractors, and they could also be people where they don't have a money agreement. Patrick, please tell me how I'm wrong.
Right. So two things here, right? So a subcontractor is there's direct privity of contract between the awardee and that third party entity to perform work that's explicitly listed in the contractual arrangement. So that's a really wordy thing that sounds like a legal disclaimer, and I apologize. But essentially, it is, we're over here and we're NSF, we're the awarding office. You've got the prime or lead entity who received the award. And then there are those folks who are going to help them do the direct performance of the award. Those are really subcontractors. In terms of collaborators, they could be subcontractors, or they could be fourth parties who are either funded by the awardee or have some other business relationship that's not for the direct purpose of advancing our award to the awardee. And again, this is a hard one where if there are very specific questions people have, we would have to walk through the fact set and we could help figure out what that business relationship should be called. But essentially the subcontractors are those third tier entities that are directly helping perform the work under the award.
Joda, I have a question for you. The solicitation emphasizes organizational autonomy, while the webinar mentioned administrative functions may be subcontracted. Could you elaborate on what level of administrative support from a university during startup or phase 0 is consistent with NSF's vision without undermining independence?
Yeah, so this is really about and I think the factor assessment, I think, touches on a number of the standards we're looking for quite well, without providing so many specifics as to be prescriptive. But we anticipate that an administrative entity, whether it's a fiscal sponsor or a host institution, could provide things like back office support, payroll, HR, those kinds of things. And in fact, they could include facilities and other resources, but still providing the X-Labs leadership and senior key personnel the autonomy necessary to set their research direction, to bring on the hires they need within reason. And I say within reason to say, like, there should be broad flexibility to bring on the talent they need, but recognizing that it may not be legally possible or advisable to pay anybody anything. I think that there are sort of common sense limits to that. But again, we expect that the X-Labs team is going to be really responsible for driving its direction and have the capacity to make research decisions quickly. And by quickly, we mean within days, not sort of weeks of back and forth with multiple forms, and making sure that every single person within a university leadership chain is approving of every single hire or decision that's necessary to sort of adjust a research plan. I think, again, this is laid out at a pretty high level because we expect that models are going to look different depending on how teams propose. So I guess to take a step back, high levels of administrative support are expected and even potentially encouraged. We want researchers to spend time doing research, not necessarily doing HR and finance work. But we want the leadership to be in the driver's seat when it comes to executing on the mission itself, and not subject to a committee vote.
Patrick, I have a couple of questions related to sort of budgets and what they can be spent on. NSF X-Labs would like to support platform technologies that would have a major impact on the field. Having said that, will X-Labs be able to set up some fabrication labs that support the equipment to operate this lab so that new earth-shaking ideas can be developed? How much of the budget can be used on that infrastructure to set up a lab? Or would NSF prefer the establishment of a subcontracting effort, which could be more limiting, and would establish fabrication labs so that the company can do its experimental work through a subcontract?
Right. So that's a hard question to answer. So I think two things on that. One is as parts of a proposal, an organization would come in and say, here's what I'd like to do. And then NSF will evaluate that in accordance with the stated criteria that we'll use to evaluate all proposals. So that includes your fabrication facilities, that may be something. Again, depending on the specific proposal that NSF would consider funding, it may not be. Again, that's there's no prohibition on that, but there's also no explicit requirement to do so. So in the sense that what portion of the budget, again, we're going to rely upon offerers to come in with a proposal and justify the use of funds if NSF were to provide an award to them. So I'm not sure I can answer that question specifically. I don't know, Becca or Adam, if you want to add anything to that.
I'd just add, tell us what you need. What are you trying to do, and what do you need to get it done? And we can see if that is possible. We can see if it would make sense. I mean, the budget is pretty high, I would say, for it could go up pretty high for an NSF program. It's not really high enough to support building a new fab, but it is high enough to support, some realistic options in that kind of area. Tell us what you need in order to accomplish your wildest dreams. And, we're looking for bold ideas.
Yeah. But Becca, you also highlight, which I think is important. At the end of the day, these are taxpayer dollars. These are our tax dollars, right? And so, yes, we want the wild dreams come true, but we also need to do so as responsible stewards of taxpayer funding, which means that if there's clearly another alternative that would still suffice and push the mission forward, but would make more sense financially, like that seems to me reasonable to ask teams to look at that. But do not, if that's not the case, or if there's a strong argument to the opposite, then make that argument. Over.
And I think the one thing to point out there, and Adam, you just jogged. I thought, look, again, I mentioned earlier that the negotiation process is fairly in depth between NSF and the potential awardees. At that point, if we see things that are great ideas, but may need to have some negotiated changes before we can make an award, that's when we'd have discussions. And that's if this sort of discussion comes up at that point, that's where we can discuss the benefits or potential drawbacks of any requested NSF funding.
I'll also add, sorry, Bridget, the 1.5 million for phase 0 is pretty fixed, maximum. And it would be like during phase 0 that we figure out and negotiate the phase 1 budget, which is kind of this level of budgetary decisions that we're discussing right now.
So Becca, following up on that last point, when and how is the budget submitted? How much does the initial 8-page proposal for a phase 0 award have to discuss the budget plan for phase 0 and or for future phase 1 work?
It really should not discuss a budget, right? We haven't given you a lot of room to do the written proposal, and we do not expect you to propose a budget. We are assuming that all of the phase 0 proposals that come in are within that $1.5 million budget, or, presumably a lot of them are going to be a lot less, right? Because not every team is going to need $1.5 million for 9 months in order to do the type of phase 0 work that we're asking for. But the budget will not, the phase 0 budget is not going to be required until the oral proposal package. And that is for your benefit. It's also for our benefit, right? You don't have to prepare it ahead of time. We don't have to read a million of them ahead of time. So it really is to reduce administrative burden and to really evaluate you by those 2 selection criteria. What is your idea? Is it impactful? And do you have the team together in order to execute it?
Joyda, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions related to IP. Let's first talk about IP when universities are involved, whether it's background IP or IP generated by the X-Lab. How does the X-Lab maintain IP autonomy if some of its collaborators are universities?
Yeah, so first off, I want to make sure that folks understand that the X-Lab is not a multi-university like collaboration or center scale effort. Like this would be a team that is dedicated on a single mission, working full time on it, or at least the senior key personnel would be full time on it. But understanding that some of the IP would be generated, perhaps like being pulled in as background IP from universities or from university-based work. I think that's up to the team to tell us how they are going to ensure that that is broadly disseminable. And I think that may involve negotiations during the phase 0 process. We anticipate providing teams with a certain level of support and technical assistance to help teams work through some of these issues. So you don't need to have every single answer figured out, but I do think that you should have done some initial due diligence to understand how you're going to pull in the necessary IP to accomplish the mission, and then also that there is a willing partner on the other side to negotiate with, and you have a general idea of what your framework might look like in order to make sure that that technology that you develop based on that background IP has a running fighting chance at being broadly disseminable as a platform technology. From there, I'm afraid we can't provide a ton of specifics at this point, because I think that's what really we're hoping that you all provide in your proposals themselves. But please understand that the specific requirements in the initial 8-page application are quite high level at this point. So you don't have to have everything figured out.
And Joda, what if instead of being affiliated with a university, what if it's a small business that's the host institution for a phase 0 proposal submission? Will this host institution have any say in the equity assignment of the new entity set up for phase 1 IP?
Yeah. So again, these are, I think, important questions that we may ask as you propose a structure that might involve an entity that's housed within a for-profit commercial entity. And we would expect maybe at least a hint that you were going to mitigate that in some way, or that you're going to maintain a governance structure that allows you to stay focused on the R&D mission that you proposed. And that might be done through a specific equity-like structure that is assigned directly to a subsidiary. It might be done through explicit licensing rights that you communicated or spelled out contractually. We are going to look to you all to propose to us how you are going to meet the autonomy factor assessment and stay in the spirit of it. But I have a high level of confidence there are many, many ways to do that. And I think it's just going to be dependent on what's sort of right for your team structure. I would still, and I think I've said this in the sort of text answers, but also in prior webinars, it's going to be a tall order if you're a for-profit company to carve out a X-Lab within your structure and to provide sort of the level of confidence necessary that it could remain sufficiently independent given the sort of commercial pressures that a company often is operating under. It's not impossible by any means. I think it can be done, but I think that that is going to be if you are a company or a business looking to propose, you're going to have to really spell out how this is going to operate on the timelines of the program, and sort of really pursue that R&D pathway, and not get distracted sort of by other, completely legitimate, valid pressures that might be coming from your investors. And so I think those are going to be questions you're going to have to really think through beyond even the IP.
And Joda, one last IP question. Is it acceptable to have the X-Lab commercialize their new IP throughout the X-Lab's timeline for the financial gain of the X-Lab personnel, or would those financial motives reduce the autonomy of the?
Yeah, so, I think that's a tough one, and I think it really comes down to the fact that is the commercialization a byproduct or, an intent of, creating pathways for the technology to be more broadly disseminated, or to advance the sort of technology maturation as a part of the sort of work plan, then I think it's a possible, legitimate, model or tactic. However, I think we will be skeptical of models that seem to be a business in disguise. Like that is, because think about it this way. we are providing substantial public funding in order to provide the United States with a critical advantage and, a sector-defining platform. And if that benefit predominantly just accrues to a very small number of people or to one firm, I think that is a failure of a proposal, or it would be very, that would not be a good set of outcomes. I think we would want to see that there is something more broadly applicable that comes out of this. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that there can't be equity-like incentives or structures that allow that technology, that allow the sort of incentive structures to pull in the best talent that otherwise might not be available. But I think there needs to be some level of confidence that this technology is going to get out of the X-Lab and into the world in some way, shape, or form beyond being like a product that one company controls.
Yeah, I want to highlight our goal here is for broad dissemination of the produced technologies for impact on American competitiveness and the American people. So the goal here is not, you can't commercialize your IP. Of course, like that should be something that comes out of X-Labs, but the goal should be, is this making a high impact on America? And if you are already ready for commercialization so quickly, are you really could you have been invested in by commercial industry already? Are you the right fit for X-Labs?
Becca, another question. What is the difference between the X-Labs quantum systems topic and the scientific instrumentation topic?
It's a good question because they both do have quantum in the topic descriptions. The scientific instrumentation for sensing and imaging, there is kind of a quantum sensor aspect to that. But it is really trying to push forward like what we consider able to be sensed, what we consider knowable, and pushing forward a lot of those like applied sensing and imaging platform technologies. That can be in a variety of ways. That one's actually a quite broad topic. The quantum systems topic is very focused on heterogeneous quantum systems and kind of quantum information science, quantum information processing. And we are specifically looking for teams to build quantum interconnects, quantum integrated photonics, their supporting technologies, and those, loosely like those types of technologies that would support heterogeneous quantum systems. And so I think that's a pretty narrow, it sounds like they overlap, but I think functionally, if you're deeply in the quantum space, and maybe Paul can back me up here because I'm not, I think you'll understand that it doesn't really deeply overlap.
So next, I'd like to move to our final category of questions: program structure, phases, and milestones. Becca, can you get into more detail first about phase 0 and then about the go, no-go transition? So for phase 0, can you elaborate the key objectives of phase 0? For phase 0, should teams already identify a flagship technical demonstration that defines the X-Labs, or is phase 0 expected to determine and refine that demonstration through customer discovery, partner engagement, and planning, for example?
Phase 0 is really intended to prepare a team to be an independent, autonomous X-Lab by phase 1, and to prepare their phase 1 proposal, which will be selected for in that go no go selection phase. So the purpose of phase 1 is to make sure that you really deeply are structured like an independent team, to give you the time to structure yourself like that team, and to make sure that you are all set to go for that phase 1 funding. You can do some technical milestones, of course, during those 9 months. We encourage you to, but you don't need to do. I would stray away from like commercialization plans and commercial that kind of plans. That's not really the right scope for X-Labs. X-Labs is trying to do those big, risky, hard questions that are not yet commercializing. And then, you know, for prototypes, you can continue developing a prototype. Maybe you haven't started developing a prototype. Maybe you have a prototype and you're getting it further along. That'll be assessed based on like where you are coming into this program. There's a range of TRLs that you can come in as. So by all means, continue to develop your prototype. But the real goals is to develop a lot of those organizational structures and setup that is required to start phase one as this non-traditional independent team.
And in phase zero, for a high-risk platform where some milestones are meant to fail informatively, what organizational and cultural qualities are you selecting for in a team, and how should we design a phase zero milestone plan so that a milestone that fails still counts as a real informative result that earns a path forward rather than a strike against the team?
This is a really good question. This is a great question because if you don't, if we don't get these milestones right, negotiating with teams, if NSF and the team doesn't get the milestones right during phase zero, that's going to be a problem. They need to be set up in such a way that they are high risk, they are driving you forward, and that if the team doesn't meet a high risk milestone, maybe there is still a path forward. But that doesn't mean that a team can be set up in such a way that they're just going to keep chugging along, even if they're not making any progress into phase two, for example. So that's really why we need that phase zero. We need time to set up and figure out the phase one milestones during the phase zero period. It will be it's going to be very important to get high risk milestones that also kind of have the possibility to fail. I will also say that if you do have some really high risk milestones, you're making progress. We see you're making progress, and we believe that your team has really a viable path to making really high impact. Not missing a phase one milestone as we get into the phase two selection period. It may not be something that deeply counts against you, or is something that we're not going to continue with if you don't make all of your high risk milestones.
Yeah, Becca, can I think the question actually referenced at one point intelligible failure, which I find particularly attractive because I think we also need new words for failure. We treat it as if it's a single thing, right? And it's clearly not. But I think that the value of intelligible failure, and Becca said it far more eloquently than I ever could, is that it provides that feedback loop quickly that allows you to adjust and still keep making progress forward. But it also gives you the information to make a credible judgment of like, hey, this isn't going to work, or this could work, but we go in a different way. But to Becca's point, coming up with the milestones that provide that intelligible failure, as opposed to, well, it just didn't work, I think is going to be really, both exciting but hard work in phase zero. But that's what's great about X-Labs, in honesty, is like that we can embrace that early on with open eyes and work with teams to get that right over.
And we'll say this to phase zero teams as well, once they're selected, but if the milestones that are proposed are kind of easily achievable by teams, kind of just, oh yeah, we'll do this and we'll do this and we'll do this, and we just can kind of check off the list, that's not going to be very attractive for NSF for achieving a phase one. So your milestones that you propose during phase zero are part of your proposal package for phase one.
And Becca, can you elaborate on that a bit? Can you elaborate on the go, no-go phase transition, the metrics and selection? Are these metrics self-selected or defined by NSF?
So the metrics for the selection for phase one will be defined by NSF. They will be provided to all teams that start the phase zero process. We have not kind of specified them, but they will look like the selection criteria. We are anticipating they will be similar to the selection criteria provided in the OTASO for phase zero teams. The criteria, after 7 months of the phase zero, Teams will produce milestones that they will be invoiced to NSF for. So they will be paid milestones in order to produce different parts of their proposal for phase one. These are things like their milestone plan, or their phase one milestone plan, or their phase one budget, or their IP management plan, their governance structure plan. These will together become their proposal to phase one. And NSF will then select using predetermined selection criteria that we will give teams, the teams that will go forward into phase one.
We have 2 more questions, and then we're going to close the webinar. Paul, this is a question on the technical topic. Can you say more about quantum integrated photonics? For example, does that mean single photon or photon number resolved states being produced and manipulated? Or can it also mean classical light sources meant to manipulate or control optically active qubits, for example, atoms? Oh, Paul, you're muted again.
Sorry about that again. Yes, I was saying that it could also mean the second suggestion. But remember, we're looking for platform technologies, right? We're looking for technologies that can create possible breakthroughs in other fields. So I would focus on the first suggestion, which is single photon related types of technologies. Entangled technology.
We're going to sneak in one more question that is related to the topic. I don't know if this is best for Paul or Becca, perhaps. We have a quantum integrated photonics platform that could be used for an imaging application, but it is based on integrated photonics as the base platform. Is it eligible for both topics? Can we submit to both topics?
You can submit to both topics. Each lead organization can submit up to 2 proposals per topic announcement. So you can submit to both topics. It's just that if you submit more than one proposal to the same topic announcement, they have to have different key personnel. If you have multiple key personnel on different proposals, it is technically allowed. In this case, it sounds like it's in scope of both.
I would agree with what Becca said.
All right, here's our last question. This is for Adam. Adam, if you could give applicants one piece of advice that would most improve the competitiveness of their phase 0 proposal, what would it be?
I should defer to Joda and Becca and the other team that have been here putting all this effort into putting together an incredible opportunity. But I'll avoid like waxing too poetic. I also won't say things like "Don't use Garamond." I'm kidding, by the way. I don't know if there's restrictions on that.
There is. You have to use Times New Roman.
All right, good. Thank you. Don't use Garamond. You're welcome. Okay, so maybe this won't be helpful, but I hope it is. Let me offer the Steve Jobs kind of approach of be bold and be creative. And by what I mean by that, at least, is the boldness comes with the vision. You're going to apply for this because you have a vision of being able to make a dent in the world, a good dent, with this mechanism that you can't some other way. Convey that vision. Be bold. But as we also say, vision without execution is hallucination. So the be creative part is the creativity that's going to be necessary to come in and make that vision real. So again, realizing that is probably not as practical advice as people would like. I really just want to once again emphasize this idea. This is an opportunity to be bold and be creative. Do that, please.
This is an opportunity that you have to tell us what you need to create really high impact that's not otherwise possible in the system. Please tell us what you need. Propose the team that you need. That is kind of the dream team. Propose the facilities that you need. Propose what you need to really get something done. And Put together a great team. Put together a great team with a diverse range of experiences, of qualifications, and of experience levels. We're looking for teams that can really change the world.
And on that note, we're going to wrap up the webinar for today. Thanks so much for joining us. A recording of this event will be posted on the NSF website. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.